Hi everybody.
Hi.
Welcome to the Near Apocalypse of '09. This is an ultra-condensed panel version of something that I have been writing for almost 4 years and am going to still be writing well into the mid-2020s. It is a big project. It is the biggest thing I have ever undertaken. It is a years-long ongoing multi-volume project. Oh, by the way, hi, I'm Jen A. Blue. I write books. I am having at least one chapter on every episode of every DCAU show, plus web shorts, comics, all kinds of stuff. I am going through the entire thing and covering all of it. This is why it is taking a very long time, because Batman the Animated Series alone is over 100 episodes. Anyway, this panel is basically just a quick overview of what I'm trying to do. I'm going to be running through kind of the core concepts of the project, starting with a quick introduction to psychochronography, which is not as scary as a word with that many syllables might seem. And then I'm going to be talking about the 3 core concepts I'm playing with, which are deferred apocalypse, hence the title, heroic trauma, hence the subtitle in the Connecticon program, and the protector fantasy. And finally, I'm going to talk about the power fantasy, which is often associated with superheroes incorrectly. And then I'm going to talk about kind of what has evolved as the big question that I'm trying to answer. Along the way, I'm going to be talking about the DCAU a lot. Yay, DCAU! Woo! Because, again, that's ultimately what the project is about. So, let's start in with psychochronography. So, there's this concept that originates with Alan Moore, although it draws from a lot of people before him, called idea space. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It is imagining all of the ideas everyone has ever had as if they existed in some kind of a space. Ideas that are connected in some ways will border each other in this imaginary space, while other ideas are more distant. My friend and mentor, El Sandifer, then connected this with the idea of psychogeography, which is something that originates with a school called the French Situationists, who were awesome. They were a group of Marxists living in Paris about 100 years ago, who decided that the best way to overthrow capitalism was with spectacle. So they would stage large public pranks in order to call people's attention to the absurdity of life under capitalism. These guys were great. But one of their things, one of their perhaps less amusing things, although not unamusing, was this idea of psychogeography. The idea of psychogeography was to just start walking through a physical space, the streets of Paris, for example, and use that as a means to explore idea space. Talk or write about what it means that this building with this history is next to this building with that history, or that these two things are across the road from each other, or that kind of thing. Use that to connect the ideas between them. Psychochronography is then Sandifer's combination and new take on this. Her idea was to take something that ran for a long time, a serialized work like a long-running comic book or a TV series, or a soap opera, anything like that, and use that as your walk. Take that as your walk through time and use that walk to explore idea space. So looking at what it means that this idea is next to this idea. So this is what I am doing with the DC Animated Universe. I am using the DC Animated Universe as a walk through the idea space of the 90s and early 2000s. This is a period that interests me a lot. It's the period when I was a teenager and in college, and saw a lot of weird stuff happening then. So, all that fancy highfalutin and stuff out of the way. Let's talk about how we're actually applying it. let's start with the case of Harleen Quinzel, my favorite comic book character ever that no one writes well. Like, I can count on one hand the number of things I've seen where her character isn't butchered. But I love her, nonetheless. So, she's based on the Harlequin and the Joker. Those are the two things being drawn together to create this character. The goal was, let's create a female sidekick to the Joker, and let's base her on the figure of the Harlequin, which is also what the Joker on the playing card is based on. So the result actually turns out to be a character, especially in the DCAU, who's the Joker but better. She is better than the Joker at doing what the Joker does. The Joker is playing at chaos. The Joker talks about wanting to create chaos, but in almost everything he's in, and especially in the DCAU, what he really wants is to be in charge. He wants control. He wants to push people around. He wants to do what he wants to do and kill who he wants to kill, but ultimately he's about power. The Harlequin, meanwhile, is a much older figure. The Harlequin comes from the Renaissance, when it was involved in the British tradition of pantomime. And before that, in the Italian Commedia dell'arte. I probably butchered the pronunciation of that. I'm not great at pronouncing other languages. So what the Harlequin is the slapstick comedic figure. They wear a weird costume and they bounce around the stage and they bop people with something, I kid you not, called the magic bat. And they transform the play because the original parts of the pantomime play, of the Commedia dell'arte play, are relatively serious. They're often like tragic love or, people being murdered, all that kind of stuff. And then, once that story is wrapped up, the Harlequin will come out and start bouncing around, bopping people with a magical bat, and wave around and basically distract the audience while they change the scenery to move into a comic play called the Harlequin. And so their job is to upturn everything to change the tone to be lighter. And in the process, they introduce an element of magic and the supernatural. The serious play usually doesn't have that, while the Harlequinade usually has, like, fairies or, people being transformed or that kind of thing. And this is what Harley does. The Joker in the DCAU is a really dark figure. Harley really isn't. Harley just bounces around having fun. Harley is never taking anything seriously. She's just fun, except for when she's being abused and having to deal with that. But other than that, she's just fun in a way that the Joker isn't. She's funnier than he is. She is the one who succeeds in making Batman laugh, not him. The other thing about the Harlequin is that they traditionally represented the figure of the other. I've talked about that in a couple of earlier panels this weekend, but very briefly, traditionally the Harlequin was a man. The Harlequin rejected social norms. They would upturn them. They would be disrespectful to authority. They would be, breaking rules left and right as part of the comedy of the show, because people breaking rules is funny. In Harley's case, this is through criminality. She rejects social norms by going out and committing crimes. But that's not the only sense in which she breaks social norms. She's bi, and has an amazing relationship with Poison Ivy that I ship the hell out of. But I barely need to ship it because that subtext is almost text. And in fact, in the comics, pretty much is straight up text. The kind of Christmas episode that started the New Batman Adventures, the one that's like little story segments, The segment where they have Bruce Wayne hostage. In the comic, that starts with them lounging around, half-dressed, in a hotel room that only has one bed. I mean, and talking about their Christmas plans together. To which Ivy brings up the point that Harley is Jewish, which is not actually stated in the show, but kind of a neat extra touch. It's just another way in which she is outside the norm, because Jewish characters are pretty rare in cartoons, especially in the 90s. They've gotten more common since then, but the default assumption is still that all characters are Jewish, and especially that all characters celebrate Christmas. Because in a cartoon, if you don't celebrate Christmas, you are evil. And must be taught the error of your ways for not celebrating Christmas. I may have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about that. So this is the kind of stuff I'm doing. This is the kind of ways I'm exploring the DCAU and the characters and the episodes, is looking at what ideas are coming together here. Let's then move on to some of the core concepts that I've kind of been working with. So this quote here is from a very wise woman, my stepmother, and it was that you can't understand the 90s until you understand that no one expected to make it out of the 80s alive. The 80s were a dark time. I was a kid, but I still remember some of this stuff. The 80s were full of dire warnings of the impending apocalypse. The environment was collapsing around us. There was a hole in the ozone layer, and we were all going to fry. Also, there was an ice age coming, and we were all going to freeze. Also, the planet was getting warmer, and we were all going to boil. Also, there was pollution crowding the skies and water, and we were all going to be poisoned. Some of these turned out to be basically true. Others turned out to not be true, and others turned out to be true, but we stopped them before they get too bad. It actually can be done. The ozone layer is no longer anywhere near the problem it was when I was a kid. There were also religious predictions of the end of the world going around. This was the beginning of millennial hysteria. Not millennial like people of my generation, and looking around at the crowd, probably most of you. Millennial in the sense of the year 2000 is coming and we are all going to die. There's going to be Y2K. There's going to be, the second coming. There's going to be the apocalyptic war that ends the world. Doom is nigh, and everything is going to end. And of course, the big one, nuclear war. Because the Soviet Union and the US were locked in an eternal battle of good versus evil. Because we were, good, upstanding capitalists, and they were evil communists, or they were good, upstanding communists, and we were evil capitalists. And we were going, inevitably at some point, somebody would blink, and the missiles would fly, and everyone would die. The Cold War was gonna kill us all. And then, right near the end of the 80s, the Cold War went, ended not with a bang, but with a fizzle. So all these people, everyone, was geared up for the world to end. And then it didn't. So we spent the entire 90s going, well shit, now what? There was no final battle of good versus evil. Stuff just kept happening. History kept going. If there's no final battle of good and evil, is there even any such thing as good and evil? Enter the wave of 90s anti-heroes. We were craving this apocalypse we missed. People wanted it. Not in the sense of people wanted to die or wanted violence and destruction, but people had been under a lot of stress expecting the world to end. They wanted the other shoe to drop. They wanted something to change. And when things didn't so much spectacularly change, it's just go, There was a certain sense of, well, we're stuck with this forever then, aren't we? Enter the infamous Gen X ennui. There was this despair at the idea that the status quo would continue forever. And there was survival guilt. Survival guilt is normally when someone else dies and you survive, and there's a certain kind of guilt there where, why am I the one that survived? Why did they die? Do I really deserve to be the one who survived? What was weird was in the 90s you had that happening on a societal level because everyone survived, but everyone was supposed to die. So did we really deserve it? And a lot of people had a lot of struggle with that, which also contributed to the infamous Gen X upbeat. Now, what does any of this have to do with DCAU? We'll get there. Because superheroes are the incarnation of deferred apocalypse. Superheroes are a good that defeats evil but never destroys it. They are constantly up against the doom of everything, the impending end of the world, and it never actually happens because they always prevent it, but they never solve it. Because the villain always gets away, or he goes to jail for a while and he gets back out, or he dies, but this is comics, so he'll be alive again the next time there's a writer who likes him. It just continues. They maintain the status quo. They don't bring change, they protect against it. And this is really important, superheroes are always survivors of life-shattering events. They are survivors of events that, at least on a personal level, were apocalyptic. They went through something that destroyed their lives and came out of it as superheroes. Villains, by contrast, are very often apocalypse occurring or completed. They are, I don't know why I have survivors written there for Mr. Freeze. Mr. Freeze is pretty obviously the impending ice age that was supposed to happen. It was an error. The Joker is the overwhelming chaos that is going to occur in the apocalypse. Blight from Batman Beyond is a walking nuclear wasteland. Like, he is Fallout. And Darkseid, Darkseid is literally the ruler of apocalypse. Like, you know? So let's talk about Mr. Kent. He literally survived the apocalypse. Krypton was destroyed in an apocalypse, and he was sent to Earth. But it's more than that in the DCAU, because the destruction of Krypton is the very first image we see after the redesign. So the destruction of Krypton isn't just the destruction of Krypton, it's also the destruction of the darker world that was Batman the Animated Series. Literally darker. Because up until that point, they were drawing in colored ink on black paper. And after the redesign, they started drawing on white paper with black and colored ink, as is more traditional. The shows literally got visually brighter. Batman the Animated Series ended. The very next image we saw of the DCAU was the opening credits of Superman the Animated Series, which opened with the explosion of Krypton. So he survived this apocalypse, and is just unwaveringly a good guy. He has a very particular definition of good, but he unwaveringly sticks to it. Except when he's being mind controlled by Darkseid, but we won't talk about that. For him, part of what that means is deferring to authority. Because he doesn't want, he's caught in kind of a trap. If he says, okay, this, the government that we have is great and all, but they are totally incapable of keeping Lex Luthor under control, so I'm going to overthrow them and do it myself. That's when we get the Justice Lord scenario. It's not a good thing. But at the same time, it means he's doing nothing about this problem. That said, where he can, he does fight corruption. When people are actually breaking the rules as opposed to exploiting them, he will fight against them. Meanwhile, you've got Lex Luthor, and this was a relatively new take on Lex Luthor. Crisis on Infinite Earths happened in the mid-'80s. And that was the end of Lex Luthor the Mad Scientist and the beginning of Lex Luthor Corporate Overlord. And Lex Luthor is the 80s incarnate. He is a corporate master. He is rich as heck, wears power suits, totally untouchable, totally in control. He is smooth and slippery and nothing sticks to him. He is incredibly selfish. He is the incarnation of the 80s, like, greed is good way of thinking. And he's super, super, super corrupt. Again, the 80s. But as the 80s get more distant, that stops being our main Superman villain. The farther away the DCAU gets from the 80s, the more and more Superman's nemesis shifts from being Lex Luthor to being Darkseid. It shifts from the 80s as the thing he's fighting against to the apocalypse as the thing he's fighting against. Which is to say, he shifts from that old status quo was bad and we need to keep it from coming back, to this status quo is good and we need to keep it intact. Alright, now I'm going to talk about the next pillar, heroic trauma. This is a really important concept to my work, and I think it sheds a lot of light on superheroes and why we like them. So let's start by defining trauma. Trauma in the psychological literature is defined as stress that overwhelms your ability to cope. These are two very important elements of this definition. Because they mean it can vary wildly between people. Because different people find different things stressful to different degrees, and different people have different capacity to cope with different things. But when you get the bad combination of the two, when you get a low point in your capacity to cope and a high point in stress, trauma ensues. And to be clear, stress is being used here in the sense of the psychological term. It's not, I have too much work to do, so much as there is an earthquake going on and I am going to die. Or who knows what else it could be. I mean, there are people, if somebody has a very low ability to cope and a very, very high amount of work to do, that actually can become a trauma. But all of that said, there are some common features in trauma, both in what it causes and in what it does to you. The single biggest thing that increases the probability of trauma is loss of support. If you feel that you are alone and have no one to turn to, if you feel that the things that you rely on to help you cope are not there for you, then that almost guarantees that any high stressor you encounter is going to cause trauma. Because the loss of support in itself is traumatic. Now, a few important common symptoms of trauma then that are particularly important to understanding superheroes. One of the big ones is fragmentation of identity. People who have experienced trauma often feel like they are two separate people, the person before the trauma and the person after. In extreme cases, they may even feel like multiple people now. The more common version of that is feeling like they don't have a true self. There's just the partial me that I am in that situation, and the partial me that I am in that situation, and the partial me that I am in that situation. In really extreme cases, this can combine with disassociation to result in them actually being different people in different situations and not always being able to remember what's going on in the different ones. That's dissociative identity disorder. Another common thing that traumatized people do is isolate themselves. Because they feel like there's not a true self, because they feel broken, because they feel shattered, they hide away from the world or from other people. They will avoid making intimate connections with other people. They will avoid getting too close to anyone. In extreme cases, they will avoid going outside. They try to isolate themselves away from a world that they have experienced is too painful to handle. And finally, there's traumatic memory. Trauma has serious effects on memory. For one thing, it causes memory loss, particularly around the event that caused the trauma and events prior to it. But it also causes flashbacks, or it can. This is like the most well-known symptom. This is the one you'll see when somebody is a trauma victim in a movie or a TV show, is something will remind them of their trauma, and they will return to it. In real life, this is usually an emotional thing. Something reminds them of their trauma, some trigger occurs, which could be almost anything that in their brain has been attached to the trauma. And they emotionally re-experience the trauma. They feel what it felt like. If it was something that was very frightening, they will start to panic. If it was something that was very, emotionally painful, they might start to cry or become depressed or even suicidal. In movies and TV shows, this is usually dramatized up a little bit by having them actually think they are re-experiencing the trauma, like seeing it, hearing it. That happens, but it's actually really uncommon. Superhero origin stories are almost always traumas. They are cases of overwhelming stress that transform the survivor. I already talked about Superman. Your entire world ending and losing your family is really traumatic. Even though he was an infant at the time and doesn't actually remember it, doesn't matter. Again, traumatic memory loss. You often don't actually remember the traumatic event, but return to it emotionally when exposed to a trigger, which Superman does. Think about what kryptonite does to him. He gets weak, he gets pale, he gets sweaty, his heart races, he has trouble breathing. Those are the symptoms of a panic attack. Kryptonite isn't affecting him with its radiation. I mean, it is in the story, but metaphorically speaking, what's really going on is kryptonite is his trigger and sending him into a traumatic panic attack. He's got PTSD. Fragmentation of identity. Superheroes almost always have that. They have a before and an after. They have the old me that I was before this happened, the Kal-El, the Bruce Wayne age 11. Then you have 11 or 8. I always want to say 11, but it's actually 8, isn't it? Then you have the hero and the secret identity. Clark Kent, Superman. Batman, Bruce Wayne. Jumping outside of DC, Spider-Man, Peter Parker. Where Spider-Man is actually a really fun one because Spider-Man's trauma is not getting bitten by a spider. That's not what made him a superhero, that's what made him a wrestler. His trauma is seeing his father figure murdered in front of him. That's what made him a superhero. Second of all, just as happens with traumatic memory where triggers forcibly cause the person to re-experience something emotionally equivalent to the original traumatic event, origin stories get repeated and reiterated more than any other superhero story. The most retold story for a hero is their origin story. Always. Always. Every superhero, the story about them that has been retold the most is their origin. The Spider-Man newspaper comic retells his origin story every Sunday, or at least it did. I haven't read a newspaper comic in a decade. Superman's origin story has been told in 2 or 3 movies, 5 cartoons, several different comics. Spider-Man's origin story has been told in 4 movies in the last decade alone. It happens a lot. And then the other thing is reiteration of it. The most iconic stories for a superhero tend to return to similar emotions to their origin story. The most iconic story for Superman after after his origin story, the one that's retold the most is the time he fought Doomsday, yet another apocalypse, and died and was reborn as someone, quote unquote, someone else. Excuse me. But for a better example of all this stuff how all this stuff works in heroic trauma, let us turn to the very first case in the DCAU. The DCAU's hero, the very first one, Bruce Wayne. His trauma is the death of his family. His parents were murdered right in front of him when he was 8 years old. That is more stress than most people could cope with even as adults. And it traumatized him. It terrified him. He lives in a state of constant repetition of this trauma. He is always reliving it. We see that throughout the series. One of the best examples of this is in the two-parter Two-Face, where he has a nightmare that connects losing Harvey Dent as he's becoming Two-Face to the murder of his parents, and specifically to the gun. He still hates and fears guns. And the death of his family just comes up again and again and again. It also gets reiterated. Some of Batman's most iconic stories involve him being helpless while a member of the Bat family is horribly hurt, often with a gun. This is what happened in The Killing Joke. This is what happened in Death in the Family. This is what happened in the DCAU in Return of the Joker. Robin is stolen, tortured, broken, turned into a mini Joker, and Batman can do nothing. So what does he do with all of this? What he does is weaponize his own fear. He takes all the terrors that he felt as an 8-year-old boy and incarnates them as something else he was afraid of as an 8-year-old boy, a bat. And he takes that bat and he wears it. This is something only an 8-year-old could come up with. He is going to dress up as the thing which scares him most, to fight the other thing that scares him most, and he is going to end crime by punching it in the face until it stops.
But never taking it too far.
But never taking it too far, and I'll get into why that is. This is really important. One of his most iconic lines in the DCAU is, I am terror, I am vengeance, I am the night. There's a great story that, Kevin Conroy tells about how after 9/11, he volunteered to work in like a kitchen that was making food for firefighters that were helping. And this is like immediately after 9/11. And he heard someone in the next room saying, "Hey, I think that guy in the kitchen is Batman." And this other person like, "No, it's not." And they start arguing. And he just let out in the kitchen, loud enough for them to hear, I am terror, I am vengeance, I am the night, I am Batman. And they flipped out. But it's not I am the night in the sense of I am darkness, although that is part of it, that is part of what he's weaponizing. He is the night. He is the night that 8-year-old Bruce Wayne saw his parents murdered in front of him. That is what Batman is. That it's his fear and his pain turned outwards. And as for fragmented identity, hoo boy, he completely rejects his pre-trauma self. There's an episode of Batman Beyond where, I'm blanking on his name, but the sound-themed villain is trying to convince Bruce Wayne that he's crazy by causing him to hear voices. And he never falls for it. And towards the end of the episode, Terry asks him, "How did you know that that wasn't you? How did you know that you weren't really going crazy?" And he said, The voices called me Bruce. That's not what I call myself. He doesn't even think of himself as that person. At the same time, however, even though he insists that Batman is his true self, he experiences it constantly as a burden. He talks about it as a burden. He describes being a superhero to Superman as the never-ending battle. He tries to discourage Batgirl from becoming one. He feels it as something that's very heavy and very difficult, and he tries to teach that to Terry. And he is utterly unable to grow past his childhood. He is stuck in it for the rest of his life. He isolates himself between Justice League and Batman Beyond. Somewhere in that chronology, he decides to leave the League and isolate himself, and then after a fight in which he's gotten old enough that he is forced to use a gun, he isolates himself completely from the world. Even in Batman Beyond, where he's starting to come a little bit more out of his shell, he's still working through another person. He won't go out there himself. He can't. Now, we actually know what event it was. We know what the trigger event was. We don't know many details about it, but we know that he left the Justice League after an event that Terry refers to as the Near-Apocalypse of '09, which is why that's the title of my project. Because it brings together these ideas of trauma and these ideas of averted apocalypse. Let's move on to the third and final pillar. The protector fantasy. So there's this idea out there that superheroes are a power fantasy. They largely aren't. If you actually talk to people who consume a lot of superhero media, very young children are in it as a power fantasy. They want to imagine themselves as superheroes, swooping in to rescue people and saving the day and fighting glorious battles. Generally speaking, older kids, teens, and adults do not. They do not fantasize about themselves as the superheroes. Obviously, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, that's not what people are reading comics for. Because adult power fantasies tend not to be, I wish I had the strength to save the day. They tend to be, I wish I had the strength to change things. And as we've discussed, change is something that superheroes really can't do. Rather, superheroes are a protector fantasy. The job of the superhero is to maintain a safe status quo for all of us. They are people who have immense power, but unlike the people who have immense power in real life, who inevitably use it for their own gain, they use it for us. They use it to protect us. They use it to help us. They use it for the good of everyone. And they punish people who might hurt us. That is not a fantasy of power. The fantasy that people are engaging with superheroes for is the fantasy that I wish someone out there had power and cared about me. I wish someone out there would protect me from all the struggles that I have to deal with in life. And one of the most iconic scenes in the DCAU happens to also be one of the best expressions of this.
That man won't quit as long as he can still draw a breath. None of my teammates will. Me? I've got a different problem. I feel like I live in a world in carton, always taking constant care not to break someone. Never allowing myself to lose control, even for a moment. Someone could die. You can take it, can't you, man? What we have here is a rare opportunity for me to cut loose and show you just how powerful I really am.
catch that? Superman has been holding back his entire career. He could punch hard enough to create a shockwave and send Darkseid, who presumably weighs more than a normal person, through half a dozen buildings before smacking him into the sidewalk so hard, or into the street so hard it creates a crater. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that because if he did that to Lex Luthor would be a stain on the ground. He doesn't do that because he is protecting everyone, including his villains, from himself. He is the ultimate protector fantasy. Someone who will not just protect us from people who want to hurt us, but will protect us when we screw up. Who will protect us when we do things that are bad and will not punish us. I mean, a little, but won't destroy us for it. Unfortunately, there is one slight problem when you combine the protector fantasy with defending the status quo. You see, when it comes down to it, the protector fantasy, the superhero fantasy, is the structures and institutions of our society are not adequate to keep us safe. So what we need is a single powerful person who will do it on their own and keep everything on their own without answering to anyone, protect us. The term for that as a political philosophy is fascism. Superheroes tend to operate on this is not to say that Superman is a fascist, this is not to say that any superhero is a fascist, this is not to say that people who make superheroes are fascists. They very much aren't. Jack Kirby fought in World War II. Jack Kirby personally killed 3 Nazis with their own knives. Jack Kirby was not a fascist, but nonetheless, the particular combination of ideas at play in superheroes lend themselves easily to that worldview. Superheroes have a tendency to operate on a normal other binary, which is something I've been kind of hammering at all weekend in different contexts. Superheroes tend to be A-okay with turning monsters, aliens, and robots into stains on the pavement. Just as long as they're not human. Just as long as they're not too human. If they're sufficiently different, if their bodies are sufficiently other, then it's okay to squish them. They tend to, Superman is a clear exception. He is trying to protect everyone. But a lot of superheroes are trying to protect specifically against people whose behavior is other. Villains and crooks in the context of superheroes, but it's still, these people's behavior is different, especially with Batman, where many of his villains are stereotyped depictions of mental illness. These people's behavior is different and they must be guarded against. This is a problem because in real life, this binary takes the form of, for example, white people versus people of color, able people versus disabled people, allo-cishet people versus queer people, on and on and on. Because the fear of change inherently is also the fear of difference, which is inherently also the fear of freedom. It's the fear that people could be different, that there is more than one way to live. And in combination with vast power, that can be a problem. Again, this is not to say that superheroes are fascist, that superhero writers are fascist, that superhero stories are pro-fascist. It's that there is always this fascist reading lurking under the surface. So this then has become, there was one more point I wanted to make. Getting back to the power fantasy. People have power fantasies. The adult power fantasy, though, is not superheroics. The adult power fantasy is, I wish I could get back at the people who wronged me. It's, I wish I could just overthrow this whole society. I wish I could be freely and openly different. I wish I could take what I wanted when I want it. Adult power fantasies aren't superheroes. Adult power fantasies are super villains. Because it's the super villains who want to change things, while the heroes want to keep them the same. Again, this is not saying go out and be a supervillain. But that is what these characters are representing, and that is a problematic element that's inherent to the superhero genre. So this is kind of the big question that I've been exploring, is can we have superheroes without this kind of authoritarian implication? Can we have a superhero who protects us from harmful behavior but not othered persons? Who is willing to disrupt or change the status quo for the better? Who empowers the people they protect instead of making them dependent? And who helps people rather than saves. This is something that I was hitting very hard in my Utena panel last night. Saving people means going out there and doing what you think they need without consulting them. Helping people means going out there and offering what you can do and letting them decide whether to take it. Saving is an act of ego. Helping is making yourself vulnerable because they might say, no, I don't need your help. Or they might ask for something that you don't want to give, and then you have to decide whether to do that. It's letting someone else, it's letting the person in need take control instead of you exerting control. All of this said, this may have already happened. Early Superman fought the KKK. He fought corrupt government officials. He was fighting against powerful institutions on behalf of marginalized people. Early Wonder Woman was all about consensual authority. Her creator, Marston, she was part of an entire project of his and his psychological theories that were rooted ultimately in BDSM, that what the world really needed was less domination, less forcing things on people, and more convincing people to go along with what was good for them, and getting consent from people to let someone else take charge when needed. And this is what early Wonder Woman was all about. These things existed, unfortunately, then the Comics Code happened. The Comics Code explicitly stated that deference to authority had to be a thing, that cops and authority figures could never be villains. It enforced authoritarianism into superheroes and helped shape what we think of superheroes as today, to the degree that it is now almost impossible to get a superhero who is recognizably a superhero and fits those things above. You could do Wonder Woman stories where she is still all about the consensual authority, but she doesn't come across as a superhero in those. She comes across as a completely different kind of hero. That said, the DCAU actually comes close. There is one scene in the DCAU that almost hits these requirements, and one character that almost fits what I'm talking about. Not quite, but in this one scene, it gets close.
What's so special about a disco of death? Yeah, with all of them. I'm an artist, just robbing banks. Captain Cole, Captain Boomerang. Probably would have gone for it if I was the captain. Gotcha! It's a snot gun.
Where are the others?
Those crabby hacks can go plug a hole for all I care. But I'm not about to rat them out.
Orion. Talk while you still have a jaw.
Hey! Would you guys please take it down a notch? Let me handle this. James, you're off your meds, aren't you?
Better off without them. Take them if I start feeling down.
You know that's not how the medicine works. You're not well.
I'm fine. You want to throw some darts?
No. Listen, James, you're wearing the suit again.
I am? Well, what do you know?
Here's the deal, buddy. Tell me where those guys went, and I promise to come see you in the hospital. We'll play darts. The soft kind.
Okay. They're gonna ambush you at the Flash Museum.
See, that's all we needed. Come on, you better get over there.
What about your enemy?
All right. Dude, as soon as you finish your drink, turn yourself in.
Got me again, Flash.
We can have the big flashy battles, the weird soap opera-ish drama, the like big picture cosmic weirdness. We can have all of that. And I feel like there has to be a way to do that without getting into these authoritarian implications. That scene isn't quite it. I'm not 100% sure what it is. I have some ideas, and I'm working towards those, but I'm still a very long way from getting there. As I believe I've mentioned, I will be finishing this project somewhere in the mid-2020s. But this is what I'm working toward, and this is the question I'm trying to answer. I believe that's about it. Yep. So thank you all for coming. Looks like we are out of time. So if you do have any questions, I can talk for a few minutes. I have another panel after this, but I can talk for a few minutes. Here is, very quickly, here are my remaining panels. The last two are The Surprisingly Good Place, which is at noon in City 4, and Lost in Transmission, A History of Accidentally Transgender Narratives, which is at 1:30 in River 2. Here's where you can find me online. I am ongoing posting this project at jennyblue.com. You can also back it at my Patreon, where I'm about 3 months ahead of the public website. I've also got a YouTube channel where I vlog and do Let's Plays. And you can find me on Twitter and Tumblr. I've also got cards if anybody wants one. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the panel.